Canada's neighbor, the US, is in trouble. The government is about to run out of money. Team Biden is warning about a constitutional crisis. The US could potentially default on its debts. The deadline is the 1st of June. An economic crisis looms, but American lawmakers are dragging their heels. In the next 4 minutes, we'll fill you in on the latest. President Joe Biden is short on time. His government needs money, else it could default on its debts. Biden's Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has issued warnings. Treasury Secretary is the finance minister of the US, and Yellen says the stability of the American economy is at risk.
It's Congress's job to do this. If they fail to do it, we will have an economic and financial catastrophe that will be of our own making. And there is no action that President Biden and the U.S. Treasury can take to prevent that catastrophe.
A catastrophe, she says. And this is not really a new problem in the US. This has to do with their debt ceiling. It's one of the most divisive issues in American politics. Washington has had this problem for years now, and it's not been able to find a permanent solution. Let me explain. Every government needs money. They need money to run schemes, to pay bills, to pay salaries, and all kinds of expenses. Where do they get this money? They take a loan. They raise a debt. All governments do it. But in America, they set a limit to this. It's called the debt ceiling. It's a limit on how much money the government can borrow. Do you know what's the current limit? $31.4 trillion. So the Biden government cannot borrow beyond this sum. Now, $31.4 trillion may seem like a lot of money, but for the US government, it's not enough. They're about to hit this limit very soon, meaning the government's borrowing is set to touch $31.4 trillion very soon. They won't be able to borrow beyond this. So how will they run the country? That is the crisis at hand. It's a bit like having a credit card. Say you have a card. You can use it whenever you want to buy whatever you want. But the card has a limit. Beyond that figure, you cannot spend. That is your credit limit. Now, what happens if you want to spend more than this? You go to the bank and you ask the bank for a higher credit limit. That's how it works. Now, think of the Biden administration with a similar credit card. They're about to touch their limit. For them, the bank is the US Congress, and the bankers are the Republicans, the opposition party. If Biden wants to borrow more cash, he will have to convince the Republicans. They must agree to raising the credit limit, or the debt ceiling as they call it. And that is the biggest stumbling block. If you know US politics, you would know that Democrats and Republicans oppose each other on most issues, and this is one of them. So Republicans are not ready to raise the debt ceiling, and Biden is furious. He says they're forcing the US into a default.
Our MAGA Republicans in Congress are threatening to do all this progress by letting us, quote, default on the debt unless we agree to their demands. They're trying to hold the debt hostage to us to agree to some draconian cuts, magnificently difficult. We're not a deadbeat nation. We pay our bills.
Now, why won't the Republicans allow Biden to top up the government's credit card? Because they sense an opportunity here. They want to score political points, and they want to make Democrats pay. So they're pushing hard on budget cuts. They want Joe Biden to make sacrifices. Last month, Republicans demanded a meeting with the president.
He's putting the American economy in jeopardy by his lack of action. Now he should sit down and negotiate.
Well, they've got their wish. Biden is meeting them today. The goal is to break the deadlock. But the president also laid down some rules before the meeting.
There shouldn't be negotiations on the debt limit. This is something that they should get to regular order and get to work on. We should not have House Republicans manufacturing a crisis on something that has been done 78 times since 1960. This is their constitutional duty. Congress must act. That's what the president's going to make very clear with the leaders tomorrow.
So Biden wants more debt without any strings attached. Well, that's not sitting well with his political rivals. They say the government cannot engage in uninterrupted borrowing. There has to be a limit. As it is, the US government has the biggest debt pile in the world. It's about to cross $31 trillion. Republicans say Biden should bring this debt under control. They're pushing for budget cuts. What happens if they fail to break the deadlock? What happens if the debt ceiling is not raised? Well, the US government could shut down, and the US economy could suffer a blow. The Treasury Secretary says the country could be pushed towards a crisis.
There is no way to protect our financial system and our economy other than Congress doing its job and raising the debt ceiling and enabling us to pay our bills. And we should not get to the point where we need to consider whether the president can go on issuing debt. This would be a constitutional crisis.
The clock is ticking for President Biden. Will he push the Republicans for a deal, or will he settle for a compromise? We'll have to wait and see.
Почетный караул 54-го отдельного комендантского Преображенского полка. Удостоены звания.
Russia is celebrating Victory Day today. Compared to previous years, though, this year's parade was a scaled-down affair. Apparently, the Russians did not have enough weapons on display. They've launched a fresh wave of strikes on Ukraine. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, a dangerous situation is developing. There is panic in Zaporizhzhia. This is the town that hosts Europe's biggest nuclear power plant, and it has been a battleground through the course of this war. A very dangerous situation, raising a serious risk of nuclear catastrophe. The plant itself has been hit several times. There have been repeated warnings and pleas to stop fighting near this plant, but they've all fallen on deaf ears. Soon after the war began, Russia took control of the nuclear plant. But now it is evacuating its people. Russians living in this area have been told to leave. 18 settlements are being evacuated, 1-8. We're talking about tens of thousands of Russians. They're leaving amid growing anxiety. There are fears of a quote-unquote severe nuclear accident. That's the assessment of the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. It's the nuclear watchdog of the United Nations, and it has sounded a fresh warning. The evacuations are happening in this area, in southern Ukraine, in Zaporizhzhia. This region has many towns and villages. Russia controls a part of this area. Last week, local Russian officials issued instructions. They said 18 towns and villages must be evacuated. Why? Apparently, the fighting is about to intensify here. The order said that Ukraine is trying to break through Russian defenses, so people here must leave. How many people? At least 70,000, according to one estimate. As you can imagine, this has led to chaos and panic, especially in this town. It's called Enerhodar. It's close to the nuclear plant. Many people who work at the plant live here. The IAEA says evacuations have begun in Enerhodar. Let me in fact quote from their report. The general situation in the area near the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is becoming increasingly unpredictable and potentially dangerous. We must act now to prevent the threat of a severe nuclear accident and its associated consequences for the population and the environment. Now, this is as clear as a warning gets. And recent developments bear this out. Reports say there's been regular shelling over the past week. IAEA experts are unable to visit this area. It's not clear what's happening at the plant. According to the IAEA, the operating staff is still there, and they're doing what they can to ensure safety, but they're operating in very difficult circumstances. To give you an idea, let me take you back to an old interview. 2 months back, the chief of the IAEA visited this plant. His name is Rafael Grossi. He said he had to cross a minefield to get to the plant. And remember, this is a nuclear power plant, and there are mines around it. Listen to what he said.
I was able to make an assessment of the damage that the plant sustained, especially on the attacks and the shelling on November 20th, which was quite severe. So that was, for me, quite important to have a look at that. These affected 2 reactors. So there is, wittingly or unwittingly, reactors were hit, or the buildings of the reactors were hit or in the vicinity. So this is very serious. This is very serious.
And what is the situation at the plant? Reports say the reactors are not producing electricity, but they're still loaded with nuclear material. The plant's power lines are damaged. It is running on diesel generators. This keeps the cooling systems online, and you don't have to be a nuclear scientist to know that this is a very dangerous situation to be in. The latest reports say gas stations in the area are running dry. Grocery stores have empty shelves, and ATMs are out of cash. And that's not all. The Ukrainian army is conducting radiation drills. Basically, they're preparing for a nuclear disaster.
As we are amid a full-scale invasion, the risk of a chemical or nuclear attack by the enemy is always there. That's why we are trained to detect toxic substances and radiation levels. We have received up-to-date equipment that is much better than our previous devices.
Neither Russia nor Ukraine can afford to ignore this. If disaster strikes, both sides will be responsible, and both sides will suffer losses. Incidentally, Russia is celebrating Victory Day today to mark their victory over Nazi Germany in the Second World War. A march was held on Russia's Red Square. Nuclear weapons were on display. President Vladimir Putin gave a speech. He used the occasion to defend the war.
We are proud of the participants in the special military operation, of all those who are fighting on the front line, who provide support under fire, who rescue the wounded. There is nothing more important now than your own combat effort. The security of the country rests on you today. The future of our statehood and our people depend on you. You are fulfilling your military duty with honor. You are fighting for Russia.
Meanwhile, Ukraine is getting more military aid, equipment worth $1.2 billion from the US. The package will include air defense systems, ammunition, and funds for training. Reports say Ukraine is preparing for a counter-offensive. It could be launched soon, but if the situation in Zaporizhzhia worsens, Ukraine might be forced to deal with a different crisis altogether, a nuclear catastrophe. Imran Khan is just one problem. An even bigger one is lurking around the corner. Pakistan could soon run out of cash. Ratings agency Moody's has sounded an alarm. They say Pakistan could soon default, meaning they won't have enough money to repay their loans. Listen to what Moody's is saying. Pakistan's financing options beyond June are highly uncertain. Without an IMF program, Pakistan could default given its very weak reserves. How weak? Pakistan has a $4.5 billion in reserves, just enough to cover 1 month of imports. So the IMF bailout is a make or break deal for Pakistan. If they get the money, they can delay the crisis. If not, they could default. What happens then? A default can send ripples across the economy. Around 147 countries have defaulted since the year 1960. All of them face the same challenges: higher interest, higher inflation, and higher unemployment. Though in Pakistan's case, I'm not so sure. Their inflation is already at 36.4%. It's higher than Sri Lanka, which also defaulted last year. So the IMF bailout is not an option anymore, it's a necessity. And what's the holdup? Well, Pakistan and IMF signed a bailout deal in 2019. They agreed to an amount of $6 billion. It was expanded to $7 billion in 2020. Some of that loan is supposed to be disbursed this year. Just one problem though, Pakistan and the IMF cannot agree on loan terms. IMF officials visited Islamabad in January for a review meet. Pakistan said an agreement was reached, but the IMF rejected this. They've imposed another condition on Pakistan. The IMF wants assurances from friendly countries like China, Qatar, and the UAE. They want these countries to fill Pakistan's financing gap, but nobody is agreeing to. And this has left Pakistan high and dry. The question is, what options do they have now? One is to turn around the economy in 1 month, which is highly unlikely, so let's ignore that. The second option is to fulfill the IMF's conditions, plead with Qatar or Saudi Arabia and get the assurances. The third option is to look elsewhere. And some reports say China could bail Pakistan out. Mathematically, it does make sense. Pakistan's total external debt is $126 billion. Out of this, $30 billion is held by China alone. It is by far the biggest lender to Pakistan, even more than the World Bank and the Asia Development Bank put together. So China coming to the rescue of Pakistan is a real possibility, but at what cost? We're not talking about a normal loan here. We're talking about a fire sale, a bailout. China is not running some charity organization. It's likely to extract major concessions from Pakistan. But even that is short term. It doesn't address the root cause of Pakistan's problem, a broken system. The civilian leadership is toothless. The military leadership is obsessed with India, and the opposition is on the streets. So who's working on nation building? Turns out, no one. Pakistan is a nuclear-armed country on autopilot, that too without a radar. From evacuations, we turn to expulsions. There's a major diplomatic crisis unfolding between China and Canada. It's been brewing for a while, but now the gloves are off. Canada fired the first shot on Monday. They expelled a Chinese diplomat based in Toronto. This man, Zhao Wei. 24 hours later, China responded. They've decided to expel a Canadian diplomat in Shanghai. She's been asked to leave China by the 13th of May. But what exactly led to this spiraling crisis? To answer that question, you must go back to the year 2021. That's when Canada's intelligence agencies prepared a report on Chinese influence in Canada. This report talked about one leader in particular, Michael Chong, an opposition MP. He belongs to the Conservative Party. He was apparently targeted by China. Why? Because Chong criticized China's Uyghur crackdown. He also sponsored a motion declaring it a genocide. And what did Beijing do? They put Zhao Wei on the job, the same diplomat who was expelled on Monday. Zhao was tasked with finding information about this lawmaker's family in China. You can guess why. To intimidate them, to make an example out of Michael Chong, sort of like a gang war tactic. Now, this report was prepared in 2021, but last week, Canadian media accessed it. They asked why no action had been taken, why Justin Trudeau's government did not confront China. The government came under pressure, which brings us to present day. Trudeau has finally escalated the matter. He expelled the Chinese diplomat. Beijing responded in kind. Plus, they're threatening Canada with consequences.
China is unwavering in its determination to safeguard its own interests. We urge the Canadian side to immediately stop unreasonable provocations. If Canada does not listen to the advice and acts recklessly, China will fight back resolutely and forcefully, and the Canadian side must bear all the consequences arising from this.
Now, this is not some isolated controversy. It's part of a larger game, a game to influence Canada's elections. I'm not saying this. Justin Trudeau is. He has admitted that China tried to meddle in Canada's elections, once in 2019, then again in 2021. So what exactly is Beijing's strategy here? The answer lies with Michael Chong. Why do you think China targeted him? The Uyghur motion was one reason, but he wasn't the only MP who supported it. There were others too. Yet China chose to target him. Why? Because Michael Chong has Chinese ancestry. He probably has family in China. And that makes him a prime candidate for China's mind games. Credit to him, he hasn't wavered. You see, Canada is home to a large Chinese origin community, around 1.8 million people. They make up around 5% of Canada's population. And China is hoping to weaponize that, to turn those people against Canada. Again, I'm not the one saying this. Chinese Canadian leaders are. Listen in to the chair of the Toronto Association for Democracy in China.
You get a phone call, not only just in the middle of the night, but you get a phone call in the middle of the day asking, so how are your parents doing back in Sichuan, China? And then you get the message. That means if you don't behave, your parents' phone numbers, address, or even their physical well-being is under threat. So in that sense, it's a very subtle threat, and they've used this on many, many Chinese Canadians. I'm sure they've done this to Mr. Totti as well.
So that's the strategy. First, target people of Chinese ancestry, then intimidate them by threatening their family back home in China. And it's not a new strategy. It's the same one that China used in Australia. 5 years ago, similar reports emerged in Australia. Reports that said that China was meddling in their elections. How did Australia respond? With tougher laws. They banned foreign donations to political parties. They also enacted a new registry of foreign agents. Demography was a factor here too. Australia, you see, is home to 1.4 million people of Chinese heritage. They make up about 5.5% of Australia's population. Like in Canada, Beijing tried to weaponize it through intimidation and through so-called cultural outreach groups. Back then, Australia had the appetite to take China on. The question is, does Justin Trudeau have it? He says foreign interference will not be tolerated, yet his government did not do anything for 2 years. They did tolerate it for 2 years. The intelligence reports were prepared in 2021, but Trudeau acted only in 2023, only when they became a subject of public debate. So the obvious question is, what was he doing until now? And I understand that the scale of China's interference may be negligible. Its impact may be virtually nil, but this is about principle. Interfering in elections is a direct violation of sovereignty. It's no different from border incursions. So what should Prime Minister Trudeau be doing now? He's already ordered an inquiry. That should shed more light on these allegations. In the meantime, let me tell you what Trudeau should not be doing. China is making the mistake of questioning the loyalty of people living abroad. Chinese Canadians are loyal to Canada, not to China. Same with Chinese Australians. Trudeau must not forget this, because his crackdown on Chinese meddling could easily turn racist. It could alienate the Chinese community in Canada. And that's what Beijing is banking on. That's what Canada should guard against. Meanwhile, back in China, a new crackdown is underway, an anti-spy crackdown. The victims are consultancy firms, foreign consultancy firms. The latest one is Capvision Partners. It's headquartered in Shanghai. Its offices across China are being raided. Last month, it was US giant Bain & Company. The month before, it was America's Mintz Group. But why are these firms being targeted? Because China says they violated national security, and so the state is coming down hard, both on the companies and the people working with them. Reports say things will get worse in the next 2 months. That's when China's updated anti-espionage law will come into force. Here's a report.
After years of pandemic-induced lockdowns, China says it's open for business. Well, except if you're a consultancy firm, apparently. In that case, China might be shutting you down. Beijing is in a battle with consultancies. The government is conducting raids on their offices in China. So far, 3 such raids have been made public. The most recent is the raid on Capvision Partners. It's a consulting firm based out of Shanghai with offices across China. It was set up in 2006 by former Bain consultants and Morgan Stanley investment bankers. Capvision offers consultancy services to foreign companies with business in China. Its website says it worked with almost 500,000 experts. And that seems to have been its downfall. Chinese media accused Capvision of paying employees of Chinese state-owned companies to leak secrets. A Chinese state employee has also reportedly been jailed for 6 years. This is for revealing confidential information to Capvision. And the raid seemed to have spooked the firm. Capvision released a statement on the messaging platform WeChat. It said it would resolutely fulfill national security responsibility and take the lead in regulating the consulting industry. It sounds like there are more raids on the way. And more consultancies will face Beijing's wrath. The Capvision raid was already the 3rd one this year that we know of. The first victim was the US-based Mintz Group. The company provides a range of services, like corporate due diligence checks, corruption investigations, background checks, and asset tracing. The group's Beijing office was raided on the 20th of March. The office was shut down and 5 of its Chinese employees were detained. Reports say its workers were held outside Beijing and were uncontactable. The Mintz Group also says it did not receive any legal notice regarding the case. Then, last month, Bain & Company came under fire. 5 employees from Bain's Shanghai office were questioned by the police. China, of course, tried to downplay the crackdown.
What I want to tell everyone is that China's national security agencies and relevant departments have recently carried out open law enforcement actions against the relevant company in accordance with the law. This aims to promote healthy development of the industry and safeguard national security and development interests.
He says it's done in accordance with the law. That doesn't really inspire confidence when the law is easy to misuse. Take, for example, China's updated espionage law. It's due to come into force on the 1st of July. The law expands the search and seizure powers of Chinese authorities. It allows the implementation of entry and exit bans on individuals. We spoke about Chinese exit bans last week. This is another law that enables them. And the law also expands China's reach. Now, instead of investigating just state secrets, the police can look at any documents, data, materials, or items related to national security. And what does national security mean here? That's up to Chinese authorities to decide. So basically, Beijing can crack down on anyone it wants to. All of this comes amid China's attempts to bring international businesses back after the years of lockdown. You'd think China would want to present a welcoming climate for commerce. Instead, it's reminding companies that they will have to toe Beijing's line, no matter how unreasonable. It begs the question, how long before companies decide they've had enough of China's draconian antics?
Email exchanges from inside the BBC, they talk about the risk of violating Indian laws. It's easier to rake up the freedom of speech debate, but does it give anyone a free pass to knowingly violate the law? America supports India because it needs India's support in return. And India is working with the US because it suits India's interests. This is how geopolitics works. Last night, he diffused a crisis with his defense minister. But today, Netanyahu was confronted with a new problem. His cabinet seems to have rebelled against him. The UK is looking at the Indian subcontinent to fill its coffers. That India seems to be negotiating from a position of power, like a partner and not a former colony. The US and Russia are dangerously close to an armed conflict. This year, 2023, New Delhi will be the capital of global diplomacy. For a country as diverse as ours, with 88% of the population illiterate, it was a very big deal to write a constitution, and that too, the world's largest. Meanwhile, if we may, here's a Republic Day gift from India for the BBC. A list of suggestions for the BBC for their upcoming documentaries. Number 1, the Kohinoor and the colonial loot. Number 2, an outdated monarchy and unhealthy obsession with the royals. Number 3, racism in 2023. We're waiting.